Yes, so I think we will get started, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on biodiversity in nature, valuing species as an economic citizen. Thank you for everyone for joining. As many of you know, I've been involved with the financial valuation of species since 2004, having studied towards actuarial science initially and moving towards the master's in finance and an MBA, and an MPhil in wildlife management and an MSc in wildlife biology and conservation. Together with this, I have worked as a senior sell-side institutional equity analyst, academically being published and co-authored multiple articles and a book, and have been continually cited and interviewed. But for those who do not already know me, my passion and focus essentially is bridging that gap between the two worlds in which I exist, the finance world and the conservation world. It is my strong belief that there is only one real way in which to unite these two worlds, and this is through the financial assessment and valuation of biodiversity. This is because it is the one unit of measurement that can easily be understood and interpreted by professionals in both worlds. Just for some little housekeeping, please note that this webinar is being recorded and everyone will be receiving a link by email on Monday. Also, everyone is muted, but please feel free to type in the chat box and I will try to respond to as many questions as possible towards the end of the webinar. You're also welcome to contact me personally to discuss any aspects discussed today. Now, more often than not, biodiversity, ecosystems, and nature are mistakenly taken to be one of the same term. There is a subtle but very distinctive difference between these three terms. But I'm not here to lecture you today on the definition of biodiversity. Instead, let's rather start off by considering what would we traditionally focus on when thinking of biodiversity's contribution to humanity. We would typically assign an ecoservice system attribute to biodiversity. This is due to the fact that biodiversity is a significant ecosystem service provider with 4 core services. The main one, which accounts for around 60%, is a regulatory service. What this essentially means is that without biodiversity, the local environment may collapse. This is by far the most important of the services because without a stable environment, the other services such as cultural, habitat, and provisioning will also begin to fail. But while we can easily state that biodiversity is important in sustaining our planet and contributing to stable economic growth, the big question is, why is biodiversity so often overlooked? Why are human lives deemed more important than other species? And we'll come to this. One of the big issues ultimately is data availability and complexity. If we think about the financial world, there is an abundance of data providers, all providing similar and comparable data points. There is uniformity in terms of these measurements and these metrics, and a general understanding of what those actually mean. But when it comes to biodiversity, it is not so simple. What sort of diversity are we referring to? Alpha, beta, or gamma? Do we mean ecosystems or species? Do we mean spatial data or time series data? And what do we mean? Is it an index or monetary measurement? Each solution is very different and serves a different purpose. Even with the TNFD, it is a challenge. How do you differentiate between indices? Well, not many people can actually explain and interpret the difference, which brings me to the concept of knowledge. Biodiversity is not a simple concept to grasp. It can take a lifetime of study, and a person may never be an expert. And then there's the issue of cost and time required to collect the data. Depending on the source, one can argue that there are around 9 million species, but most have never been studied or genetically mapped. This can take time to start the survey, and patience is not always humans' greatest virtue. So these are just some of the factors behind why there are challenges when trying to integrate biodiversity into ESG. But what we do have is different providers offering different solutions. For example, we can do a risk assessment, which is more of a qualitative risk matrix, such as that's provided by Encore. We can have a look at indexes, such as the Index of Habitat Quality. We have a good example with the Global Biodiversity Score, though one could say that the methodology behind the index could be interrogated. Or alternatively, we can use human terms to explain what biodiversity brings to society, the economy, and the environment, with the most common and understandable human term being money, such as the financial valuation established by endangered wildlife. So why does all of this matter? And why is it important to people such as yourselves? Well, there are emerging guiding principles and regulations falling into place that make it necessary to start to look at biodiversity. For European listed companies, there is the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, with a particular section focused on biodiversity and ecosystems. And there's also a line. But I think for most people globally, the focus is on the TNFD. Now, I want to emphasize that the TNFD is for nature-related financial disclosures and not specifically biodiversity. And I will explain that in more detail as this webinar progresses. It has been developed to resemble the TCFD and therefore not bring a whole new design to the market. The TNFD has been developed essentially to serve three purposes. Firstly, it's designed to help corporates and financial institutions to map and thus better understand and assess their dependencies on nature. So in this way, it's essentially similar to the risk assessment that I mentioned previously. This leads to the second concept, which is helping to measure the nature-related risks and opportunities faced by these institutions. And finally, with better understanding and transparency, these institutions would hopefully be able to shift their activities away from those that cause harm to nature. And again, I'm stressing the word nature, not biodiversity. And the TNFD recommends that this should all be done by adopting the LEAP process, namely to locate interfaces with nature, to evaluate the dependencies and impacts, to assess risks and opportunities, and finally to prepare to respond and report. Now, the TNFD has published multiple recommendations, and I think if I were to go through it all, we'd probably be here for hours. But it's important to stress a few points. Essentially, the recommendations are based on 7 key principles. There's market usability, it's got to be science-based, nature-related risks, purpose-driven, integrated and adaptive, climate-nature nexus, and the globally inclusive. And they also recommend a list of metrics that should be considered. Now, most of these metrics are effectively human-related metrics. What do I mean by that? Well, you look at them and it's tons of water consumed, greenhouse gas emissions, tons of plastic pollution. But in between that list, there are some ecosystems metrics, and yet only a handful of biodiversity-related metrics. The ones that I could find, a 3.5, use of wild species, a 4.0, number or extent of unintentionally introduced species, varieties, or strains, a 5.3, species extinction risk, and a 5.4, species population size. There's at the outset, it would seem that biodiversity actually plays a lesser role within the TNFD, and as the name nature-related disclosures would suggest, many things are directly or indirectly linked to nature. But why are we looking at this level of semantics? So let's come back to the TNFD document and definitions. Now, according to the TNFD glossary, biodiversity is defined by the CBD as the variability among living organisms from all sources, including inter alia, terrestrial, marine, and other aquatic ecosystems, and the ecological complexes of which they are part. This includes diversity within species, between species, and of ecosystems. Now let's take this one step further. According to the Smithsonian's Human Origins, humans, or Homo sapiens, are a species of primate. We can thereby infer that that humans as a species are a subset of biodiversity. Now, effectively, if we look at nature, it includes biotic and abiotic organisms, and thus biodiversity is a subset of nature. And evidently, humans are a subset of biodiversity and thus a subset of nature. Now, conveniently, this ties in to the TNFD, which used an adapted IPBES definition of nature, which states that nature is a natural world with an emphasis on the diversity of living organisms, including people, and their interactions among themselves and with their environment. Now, this definition to me is the most pertinent statement out of the entire TNFD recommendation document, whether that was intentional or not. And this is why I'm discussing the TNFD in such depth. Now, while it's not clear as to why nature was defined to include humans, it does open significant doorways as to how to perceive future and past activities. Now, at the two extremes, under this definition, one could argue that an activity which benefits humanity ultimately benefits nature. And conversely, one could argue that humans are an invasive species in many locations. Thus, should humans be removed from certain areas of the planet? I know this is quite a controversial statement to make, but it is technically the debate that this definition ultimately could lead to. And more pertinent to the work that endangered wildlife does, by recognizing humans as part of nature, it means that the value of humans should be viewed relative to the value of other species in order to actually reduce species exclusion. So if a species or ecosystem generates significant value, it should be recognized and acknowledged. In this way, perhaps it is necessary to recognize other species as economic citizens or even just residents. So let's consider what is an economic resident according to the IMF. Now, essentially, the IMF states that an economic resident has a center of economic interest in a country, and it exists within a location where it consumes goods or services and participates in production or engages in economic activities. Let's think about this. And it relates to species as it relates to species beyond that of a human. For example, is it possible to apply this definition to the gray wolf in the Yellowstone National Park? Now, I'm sure we can all agree that the Yellowstone National Park's wolf population exists in the location of the Yellowstone National Park, right? That part of the definition is easy. But then we can say, for the second part of the definition, does the wolf consume goods and services in Yellowstone? Technically, yes. it consumes nature protection and environmental protection services provided by the US National Park Services. Likewise, they might not engage in production, but they do engage in economic activities, such as tourism-related activities. And not only that, that excludes the actual ecosystem engineering services that the wolves actually provide to the park. So here comes the big question. One could, or big statement, whichever way you'd like to put it, is one could argue that the wolves could, under this definition, be defined as economic residents. And all other things constant, should we be creating and applying credits against living valuable economic residents because as an economic resident, isn't a species worth far more than just a biodiversity credit? Now, continuing with the example of the Yellowstone gray wolf, I will let you take a few seconds to absorb the figures on the slide. Now, endangered wildlife valued this particular wolf population in 2022 and calculated that on average, one wolf has a value to society, the economy, and the environment of 4.8 million euros. Now, let's comparatively look at an American's value. According to a study done in 2022 and published academically, the residual value of statistical life of an American at birth at a generous 1% discount rate is around 5 million euros. As that same American ages to the median age of around 39 years, the residual value of statistical life drops down to about 2.4 million euros. It's going to be quite a controversial statement I'm making, but this would suggest that the gray wolves are comparatively equal or greater in value than the average American. This may be bold to make, but it's something that should be reflected on. And perhaps our perception of what is valuable or not should start to shift before we realize too late that the things that our very livelihoods depend on are under threat. So what does this all mean? Well, perhaps we need to actually start recognizing how important our biodiversity is. We do not live in a vacuum, and perhaps Herman Daly from the World Bank developed the correct economic theory, which basically implies that in order to be sustainable, the human economy needs to accept that it is merely a subset of a greater global ecosystem. And that ecosystem itself has finite resources. And this is based on three key principles by Daly. Firstly, the sustainable use of renewable resources requires that consumption not be greater than the rate at which these resources can regenerate. Secondly, the sustainable use of non-renewable resources requires that the rate of consumption not be greater than the pace at which renewable substitutes can be put in place. And finally, the sustainable pace of pollution and waste requires that production not be greater than the pace at which natural systems can absorb, recycle, or neutralize them. He emphatically states, if people continue to consume natural resources on our current trajectory, all economies ultimately will fall into poverty. This is due to the fact that the cost of economic growth, which is based on the sacrifice of nature, will exceed profitability through the expansion of production, and economic growth will not produce gains anymore. It is therefore necessary to shift from the pursuit of economic growth to a steady state economy that supports life and maintains sustainability. Therefore, instead of trying to compete for the natural resources and lay claim to the planet's finite natural assets, it is necessary to find a balance between economy and environment. Now, I personally advocate that in order to find this balance, it is necessary to identify, in financial terms, the cost benefits created by integrated nature and essentially biodiversity into our economies, and embrace biodiversity as a central part of our future economic and wellness sustainability. We already know the benefits that exist in finding the balance. 3 simple sector examples. Agriculture. We are all aware as to how vital the pollinators are for agriculture. The microbial organisms in soil are equally vital to ensuring soil health, improving yields, and sequestering more soil organic carbon. With increasing climate variability, biodiversity can ultimately help to protect farms from disasters or by creating natural barriers, which leads to the idea of insurance. Healthy ecosystems are less vulnerable ecosystems. A well-covered slope with reduced soil erosion is less likely to incur a landslide and cause damage to human property. Or established seagrass beds can prevent extensive damage to coastline properties. This all reduces the insurance burden and potentially could reduce premium costs. And likewise, we can speak about health and well-being. One can argue the emergence of diseases may be caused by humans coming more regularly into contact with other species. At the same time, as I stressed in our June webinar, leaving leaves on the ground not only provides refuge to the bumblebees, but it also means leaf blowers are not required. These are destructive tools that can affect both hearing and breathing, and ultimately create a healthcare burden on the state. Now, this all leads to a compelling case for cooperation between humans and the rest of nature. There is no need to compete once it's realized that biodiversity contributes to the very economies we are trying to build at the expense of nature. And perhaps this is what the TNFD should advocate among companies and financial institutions. It is not merely about tracking and monitoring the negative or positive impacts on nature. It should be about positively integrating biodiversity and the rest of nature in terms of actual natural resources, so as to find equilibrium once again. This can be done to the benefit of business. Yes, some organizations may be held accountable for past actions, but they can find new synergies that provide both profits to their shareholders and the planet. And mere pledges will be insufficient. We are at a precipice and we need to act. The actions should not be about finding ways in which the business can look good, but rather in which they can be good. By integrating biodiversity into local businesses and measuring this in financial terms, it is possible to financially justify the cost savings created by using biodiversity in a sustainable manner. Whether it is through reduced energy consumption by greening buildings, reduced fertilizer and pesticide usage by allowing nature to take its course, or reduced land management costs by allowing for ground cover, all of these things can improve the bottom line without actually harming the environment. Yes, it is vital that all the other measurements and metrics are tracked and monitored, without a doubt. Without laying baselines and being able to demonstrate targets for improvement, it would not be possible to reach these gains. But by actually understanding the monetary gain on accepting that biodiversity plays a vital role in our activities, it allows the conversation to be had in favor of explaining why investments should be made now and actions should be taken now. And this is why endangered wildlife has specialized in the financial valuation of biodiversity. We provide companies with the ability to translate their biodiversity impact and opportunities into the common language of money. So our unique reviewed methodology allows us to calculate these critical values for species and richness so as to integrate biodiversity into cost-benefit analysis, into required reporting for sustainability reporting, for example, and for ROI calculations. We are therefore able to provide clients with both the base recommendations of the TNFD and ESRS, and also the added benefit of the financial quantification of the biodiversity impact. Because it's not merely about planting trees. Sometimes the easy solution is the wrong solution. And I think the case of introducing invasive species to control other invasive species or to increase carbon sequestration is a prime example of how not to do things. Nature is complicated. There's no doubt about that. Every choice needs a well-reasoned decision to ensure that our mistakes of the past do not become the repeated mistakes of the future. As it may turn out that the very species that are going extinct are in fact our most valuable economic citizens. Thank you very much. I think if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box.